With all the recent news around pharmaceutical and biotech companies finding success with vaccine trials, like with any other industry or subset of companies that find themselves with positive headlines in mainstream news, it is inevitably followed by a lot of investors trying to catch the wave. Pfizer and Moderna are two of the leading candidates for a vaccine, and in this video I'm going to use those two companies as a way to explain the difference between investing in pharmaceutical companies and early stage biotech so that you understand how it fits into your investment strategy. So stay tuned. Hey folks, Richard Walls here, and if it's your first time to the channel, I'd like to welcome you. What it's all about is helping you with career development and personal finance. So if that's the type of content you want to see more of, do make sure to subscribe down below and hit the notification bell so you get notified of when I post new content. And while you're down there, if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and hit that like button as well. It helps out my channel quite a bit. So with that said, let's get to it. So let's start with some definitions here. Pfizer would be considered a pharmaceutical company, whereas Moderna would be considered a biotech company. What does that mean? Well, most accurately defined, both pharma and biotech have the same goals. The goal is to develop medicines, but they do so a little bit differently. Pharmaceutical companies generally develop medicine through chemical means, whereas biotech does so organically in living organisms. Another way to put it, biotech is basically the whole foods of medicine. An example would likely be helpful here. So within the context of a flu vaccine, the traditional flu vaccine, which typically would be offered by a pharmaceutical company, is done by synthetically created antigens of the flu. It's injected into the body, prompting the body to mount a defense to it, thereby developing an immunity. In biotech, in this case with the mRNA vaccine, it's also an injectable, but the mRNA is administered and designed to give the cells in your body instructions on how to create the protein of that flu. The protein is then created against which the body develops an immune response. So instead of introducing the flu to the body, you're getting the body to create it essentially and take care of it. And there are a number of benefits or a number of purported benefits associated with this mRNA platform, but I won't get into that in this video. Now, I brought up that example to really distinguish between pharmaceutical and biotech, but really these days the lines are getting a little bit more blurred because there's a lot of cross-pollination happening. In fact, with the Pfizer vaccine, they're developing this in partnership with a biotech company out of Germany called Biotech, and they're using an mRNA platform. So both Pfizer and Moderna are using a quote-unquote biotech solution. But nonetheless, if you're looking to invest in Pfizer or Moderna, it's helpful to understand the business goals that pharma and biotech have. And generally speaking, when I refer to pharmaceutical companies, I'm referring to the more established companies like Pfizer, Merck, Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, GlaxoSmithKline. The list goes on from there. Biotech, by nature of being biotech and being a newer field of study and technology, while there are companies out there that are more established, more mature biotech companies, really what I'll be focusing on in this video are the early stage biotech companies like Moderna and Biotech. So let's compare the two on a few different points. And as an investor, here's what you should be expecting. From a financial standpoint, when you look at pharmaceutical companies, you're expecting reliable revenue and a few different earnings swings on any given year depending on how much R&D is going on in any particular year. But again, stability is key here. Whereas biotech, there's little or no revenue. There's a lot of, there's high operating costs for many years as the company aims to get a drug to market. They usually have a lot of pipeline, which I'll comment here in a moment. But they have a lot of pipeline, so at this point in time, there's not a lot of revenue. When we look at product, pharmaceutical companies, of course, have an established portfolio with continuous R&D into drugs that are in the pipeline that are either incrementally better, or from time to time they do have a breakthrough drug that can be very beneficial to the company. Whereas a biotech, there's few or no products at all in the market. Most of it is still in pipeline. Most of it's still being developed because it's a new technology or a new platform that's helping develop some of these new treatments. As far as business outcome goals, for pharmaceutical, it's about growing sales and maintaining the pipeline of incrementally better drugs. So while ordinarily you wouldn't see huge swings in the stock price one way or the other, it can happen, like I mentioned, with any kind of breakthrough drug for which there is an unfilled need in the market, and the market demand is high, or there's something safer that they've developed. But really it's going to be to grow sales at a modest clip. Biotech, on the other hand, their goal is to be successful in getting at least one drug to the market. And even, well, I should say, getting a drug approved, that's the biggest part of it. Secondary to that is getting it to market. Whether they decide to do it themselves or outsource the manufacturing, they can license the technology out, or they can get acquired by one of these larger biotech companies or one of these larger pharmaceutical companies. So as an investor, some of the investment outcomes that you're expecting would be, for pharmaceutical, again, a modest appreciation in share price and or dividends. Some of these pay dividends, as is the case with Pfizer. So when you invest, you should be expecting that. You shouldn't be expecting the same kind of growth you might see with biotech, for example. With biotech, you would expect, or you would hope for, a dramatic increase in stock price following a successful phase 3 clinical trial and or news of an acquisition. So that's really what you're holding out on if you're an investor in biotech. Now, when it comes to risk, pharmaceutical companies are going to be lower risk. Of course, you have that stability in revenue. You have an established product line with, of course, patents that last a number of years, and they've got continuous R&D into development of new drugs that are eventually going to come out. So there's a lot of continuity there, a lot of stability. Whereas biotech, much higher risk, because if their lead drug candidate happens to get to phase 2 and then to phase 3 and then fails, and that can really hurt the stock price if you're invested in a biotech company at that point in time. Now, timeline for investment for both pharmaceutical companies and biotech, the investment timeline is going to be on the longer side. Of course, with pharmaceutical, it's a longer term play. It's a more of a value play. Whereas biotech, depending on at what point you invest in the company, if they're coming out of phase 2 and into phase 3 clinical trials, or maybe even getting closer to completing phase 3, then you may not have to wait as long to understand if the stock's going to go up or down. But ideally, if there's any kind of promise with the company, you invest quite early into the process. You invest when they're doing their phase 1 or even phase 2, I think, is an appropriate time to invest. But that's the time you invest, because that's the point at which the stock price hasn't really reflected any potential successes. Obviously, it hasn't even gone to phase 3, so there's still a lot of uncertainty there. So of course, more risk at that point, but the rewards in turn are greater. So net of it is, early stage biotech companies, just like startups in any other industry, can often represent a good risk-reward proposition, whereas pharmaceutical companies, more established companies, are lower risk and of course lower reward, but in either case they can represent a good pillar in a more well-rounded investment portfolio. As far as investment outcomes, you'll see pretty clearly in action what I was referring to when you look at Pfizer. They had a relatively modest upswing in their stock price as it related to the positive vaccine news, whereas Moderna, you saw a massive spike, far more dramatic than what you would see with Pfizer. And when it comes to Moderna and other biotech stocks, this type of upswing in stock price is not uncommon after news of a successful phase 3 clinical trial, because what that signals is that not only is that drug successful and it can potentially go to market, the company can potentially license out the technology or even get acquired, which would then, of course, bring a lot of value to investors. But it also signals to investors a lot of confidence in the existing pipeline that the company already has, in that maybe there's more potential that these are also successful. So to reiterate, both of these stock price swings that we've seen recently with both Pfizer and Moderna are not totally unusual for their respective industries in pharma and biotech. But at this point in time, a lot of the optimism is already reflected in the stock price. So the best time to invest would have been at the start or even before this vaccine race. And at that point in time, you could have looked at the field of pharmaceutical and biotech companies that were getting involved, and you could have diversified your portfolio a little bit so that you have a chance in case any one of those companies were to develop a successful vaccine. But at the end of the day, it's whatever you decide to invest in, whatever is most comfortable for you, and whatever best aligns with your investment strategy. So make sure to do your due diligence and invest wisely. With that said, thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.